Thank you. We now come to the first Select Committee statement. Pete Wishart will speak on his subject for up to 10 minutes, during which no interventions may be taken. At the conclusion of his statement, I will call members to put questions on the subject of the statement and call Pete Wishart to respond to these in turn. I call the Chair of the Scottish Affairs Committee.
Eternally grateful to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I am to the Backbench Business Committee for giving us the time for the statement. And this is indeed the third report of the Scottish Affairs Committee and the result of a short inquiry we held on RBS branch closures in Scotland. Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 1st of December last year, RBS announced its intention to close 62 branches across Scotland, leading to the loss of 158 jobs. These closures would be in every part of Scotland and would result in the loss of the last branch in town for many communities, contrary to the commitment that was given by RBS in 2010. The reaction to the announcement was, as expected, overwhelmingly negative, with communities, business groups, unions and members of parliament from all parties in Scotland expressing their grave concern at the loss of such valued community assets. Rarely, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say, in my 17 years in this House that I mark today, have I seen such a unanimous response to a single issue. And when protests and demonstrations are organised in usually quiet and sedate communities such as Aberfeldy in my constituency, you know that something unpalatable has been offered to these communities. In our inquiry, we took evidence from representative groups and organisations, and we invited members of the public affected by these closures to get in touch. We held 2 evidence sessions involving senior executives from RBS, with RBS CEO Ross McEwen joining us in our second session. We took the opportunity to hear from the Lending Standards Boards, who oversee the voluntary code of practice on branch closures, and we are of course grateful to all who took the time to help us with this report. In our evidence, we were told that rural communities would be particularly impacted by these closures. Scottish Rural Action told us it can take people a long time having to use several modes of transport and at great expense to travel to the next nearest branch, sometimes involving ferries as well as public transport. We were told that those with mobility issues and caring responsibilities would also be particularly badly affected, and we received accounts from individuals concerned about the impact of their elderly relatives. The consumer group, which was very helpful to this inquiry, noted that bank closures disproportionately impact vulnerable customers, particularly those in rural areas, those without access to good broadband and those on lower incomes. We heard from business groups who told us it would be much more difficult to run a business in much of Scotland, including many deprived communities and those, like my constituents, which are dependent on tourism hotspots. The FSB, in their evidence, said closures often created additional costs for business owners, making it more difficult to manage cash flow, with productivity in the wider local community suffering as a consequence. We concluded, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the closure of these branches would be a devastating blow to the affected communities, removing vital services relied upon by businesses and disproportionately affected vulnerable customers. We were not convinced that RBS fully appreciated the damage that these closures will do to the community and businesses that rely on these branches. Madam Deputy Speaker, RBS told us in their evidence that these closures were driven by changes in customer behaviour. They said that they are closing branches in response to the increasing numbers of their customers accessing services online and via mobile devices. And where there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that customer behaviour is evolving, with more people now using digital services, what we found in our inquiry was a real demand for a local branch as a feature of local communities. We also explored whether RBS was in fact trying to lead customer behaviour by incentivising customers to transfer to digital accounts and force them onto other platforms by this programme of closures. RBS were keen to assure the committee that there were no targets set, with no incentives for digital take-up involved. However, we did see reports in the press, including a screenshot of a document appearing to show that documents and incentives were set, which we asked RBS to clarify. In their response, they told us that colleagues have goals to serve our customers, well, and Screenshot was a standard performance document in which staff are expected to agree objectives with their line managers, as well as ways of measuring against these goals. I will leave it up to this House to assess whether public behaviour in this is being met or whether public behaviour is being led by RBS. What we did find, almost quite curiously, was that these closures are not motivated by any savings to the bank. RBS will only save some £9.5 million, a significant sum, but absolutely nothing against their cost base of £4 billion. It's actually a smaller figure than what RBS spent on sponsoring rugby, which came in at £11 million per year. It begs the question, therefore, Madam Deputy Speaker, why are RBS antagonising their customer base with this unpopular closure programme for what to them is merely a pittance of a saving with all the subsequent reputational costs? It might have something to do with Unite the Union's view that is to improve the value of the bank's shares and to ripen it up to go back into the private sector. And of course, this week we find that RBS shares are to be marketed at significant cost to the taxpayer who acquired them at almost double the value when the banks were recapitalised in 2008. That then brings us on to the majority shareholder in this issue, and that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is you, me and the taxpayers of the United Kingdom, who still own over 70% of the stock of RBS. The government are the stewards of this public interest, but have showed no interest whatsoever in exercising any influence as our guarantor in this closure programme. The stock response from government is they do not get involved in commercial decisions. We were profoundly disappointed that no government minister gave us the courtesy to come to our committee and were prepared to be challenged by the committee on that assertion. And we could maybe explore further with government ministers what influence could have been exerted. And it remains baffling that as the main shareholder, the government has expressed no view whatsoever on these bank closures. We repeatedly asked RBS what would happen if the government sought to make its displeasure known and perhaps asked them to reconsider its closure programme. We never secured a satisfactory response to that question. What Ross McEwen did tell us was that he had received no representations from the UK government to the subject of branch closures. And we say in our report, if RBS does not act on our recommendation to halt these closures, we recommend that the government use any influence that it has as majority shareholder to put pressure on RBS to reconsider this closure programme. We did, though, actually make some headway in securing concessions from RBS. After our first evidence session, RBS announced a reprieve for 10 branches until the end of 2018. They also offered a variety of other concessions, such as giving the buildings that they own over to community use and assistance with digital services for high-use regular customers. The reprieve branches were primarily the last bank in town and more than 9 miles from the next nearest RBS branch. When this was announced, RBS said that should any of these branches see sustainable transactional increase and viable new income over this period, then we will reconsider the closure of the relevant branch as part of a fully independent review. RBS provided little information about how these reviews would be conducted, with the company originally charged to lead this work now unable to do so. And there remains a great deal of uncertainty about how these branches will therefore be evaluated and on what basis decisions on their future will be taken. We therefore have very serious concerns that these branches are simply being set up to fail. In our report, we say that RBS should postpone the review of these branches until 6 months after the independent reviewer has been appointed. Lastly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the whole process of consultation has been spectacularly woeful. There is currently no requirement under the Access to Banking Standard for banks to consult customers or staff ahead of a decision to close a branch. And given what we've seen in the public response to this report, there is great interest by local communities to be consulted ahead of branch closures. We therefore recommend that the Lending Standards Board consult on amending the Access to Banking Standard to require banks to consult its customers before final decisions on branch closures are taken to assess the impact of closure on these customers and communities. Branches this week, Madam Deputy Speaker, are now being closed and vital community assets are being lost. We say, even at this stage, let's see what we could do to keep these branches open. If RBS truly wants to meet the needs of its customer base, it should respond to this overwhelming evidence and halt its closure programme. Given the recent profits reported by RBS, this is a cost they could easily afford to bear.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome unreservedly the Honourable Gentleman's Committee's report. I am pleased to tell the House that earlier today RBS announced its decision, after much discussion, that the Bannockburn branch of the Royal Bank of Scotland will now remain open at least until the end of the year, and that at least is something. However, as has been rightly pointed out, since there is no financial gain for the Royal Bank of Scotland in closing any of these branches, does the Honourable Gentleman agree with me that the Lending Standards Board should publish immediately all of its workings in relation to the closure of these RBS branches?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his remarks, and I'm very pleased and satisfied that his Bannockburn branch will be amongst the 10 that will be remained open until the end of the year anyway. And he's absolutely right. There are major issues with the Lending Standard Boards when it comes to the consultation on these issues. And we were less than satisfied with their explanation why they could not give any of the information that was supplied to them by RBS about these closures. And there was a full discussion and conversation about these issues. And I think even at this stage we will try and further to secure that information for the Honourable Gentleman.
Reynolds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to the Scottish Affairs Select Committee for undertaking this work on what is an extremely important issue, and I welcome also the proposals the Honourable Gentleman made at the end of his opening statement, which mirror many of those in the last Labour manifesto. Can I ask him specifically, much is made by the Government of the availability of the Post Office as an alternative to the last branch in town closing. Did the Select Committee assess whether this is a suitable alternative for many of the communities in Scotland, particularly badly hit by RBS's proposals?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. We did take evidence from the Post Office in the course of this inquiry just to assess whether that would be possible in the way that he described and defined. And we are not satisfied that this provides any sort of real alternative. I make the example in my constituency where I'm securing severe Post Office branch cuts. But there will be transactions, and what we managed to secure from the RBS was a further commitment to ensure that relevant staff training would be given to sub-postmasters and mistresses in order to improve their skills in the renewed number of people who would be coming to them for their services.
Paul Masterton.
Deputy Speaker, I thank the Chairman of the Select Committee for his statement. I was very proud to work with him on that report. But does he agree with me that the real concern here is the terms of the review for the branches giving the reprieve? The closure date is still the same, yet the period for the review is shorter. We don't know who's going to carry out the review. We don't know what the terms of the review are going to be. And it does seem, exactly as he said, that these branches are simply being set up to fail.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman, who is a very assiduous member of the Scottish Affairs Committee, and I'm grateful for his contribution, and he's absolutely right, and he will recall some of the conversations that we had with RBS about these reprieve branches and the dissatisfaction expressed by all of us on the committee about the fact that there's no independent reviewer in place yet, and he'll recall that as part of our recommendations we say that these branches should be further reprieved for a 6-month period until somebody is in place, and we have to know the criteria in which these branches are being assessed, and what we've secured from RBS at this stage, Madam Deputy Speaker, is clearly insufficient in order to make sure a proper assessment is going to be made.
Patricia Gibson.
Deputy Speaker, and I too would like to extend my thanks to the Honourable Gentleman and the Scottish Affairs Committee for this excellent report. I wondered if the Honourable Gentleman agrees with me that this report absolutely lays bare the fact that RBS has ridden roughshod over our communities, and that the lack of consultation by RBS throughout this entire process is very clear. Indeed, the access to banking standards requires banks to make an assessment of the impact of branch closures, but this is simply not possible if banks like RBS do not consult directly with customers before making decisions on closures. And does he further agree with me that with the UK Government now selling RBS shares below market value, and RBS paying £16 million in profit and bonuses last year, and announcing record profits recently of £752 million, that my constituents in Kilwinning, Kilbirnie and Saltcoats' anger and sense of betrayal is completely justifiable?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and she's absolutely right and spot on when it comes to all of her related questions, because they are all related. I think, first of all, on consultations, we had real issues just about how the Lending Standards Board were going about this. And what we said in our report, and it's something for the Minister, is that if there is a sense, which I think there clearly is, that the voluntary code is not sufficient and satisfactory, the Government should at least examine and consider consider having statutory regulations in place so that communities are consulted in advance of branch closures, and I hope that's something the Minister might be able to take away from all this. I'll say no more about the selling of RBS shares other than what I said in my statement. It's not part of this report, though we do note, of course, the massive profits that were made by RBS in the first quarter of this year in the paltry, in respect, £91 million that's been saved by these closures, and the huge reputational cost that's been impacted on the bank because of that.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my neighbour, the Honourable Gentleman for Perth and North Perthshire, for this report. I also welcome the extension of life of the Alloa branch in my constituency that was just announced earlier this morning. Will the Honourable Gentleman join with me and other colleagues across the House in receiving clarification on these branch closure criteria? Certainly when I met with other members of the House, RBS representatives earlier this week, there seemed to be no difference or differentiation in the criteria applied for urban branches as to rural branches. That is a major concern for both North and South Perthshire.
And I'm very grateful to my neighbour for that point, and I know again that another branch of his constituency has secured that reprieve along with Comrie, which is just down the road from my constituency, Madam Deputy Speaker. And he's right, this is a critical test, I think, for RBS. This was one of the concessions that we were able to exert from RBS. It was, I think, at that point welcomed when they did announce this. They've got to demonstrate that they're not just being set up to fail. They've got to ensure that when they talk about an increase in transactions in business, that they're able to assess that properly. And I think we will have an ongoing monitoring role as a committee to ensure that this is properly monitored and that we can report back to this House in due course.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, I join the congratulations that have been paid to the Scottish Father of the House on his 17 years of service, a record none of the rest of us will be able to achieve because Scotland will be independent before any of the Scottish MPs have served 17 years now. But does he share my concern that these closures represent an overall, take place in the context of an overall diminishing of our high streets? When we look at the job centre closure programme, for example, the risks that some post offices face, other bank closure programmes and high street stores that we've seen closing. And the government, therefore, as a majority stakeholder, has a responsibility not just to the banking services, but the overall well-being of our high streets.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll offer no opinion about the longevity or thereof of other honourable members in this House, but I think I would agree with them very much in what seems to be a loss of town centre and village amenity and fixed assets. And I think the bank closure programme and the response that we saw in communities right across Scotland, not just in my constituency, but honourable gentlemen opposite, and in some of the urban centres, just demonstrates how valuable I think communities place on these particular assets. And of course we have a job centre closures which probably impact more on urban centres and centres like mine. But I think this is a real issue for government, and perhaps as part of its reflections on our report, they could take a look at what's generally happening across our high streets and all of our towns and villages across Scotland.
Ross.
Speaker, and can I congratulate the Honourable Gentleman and his committee for this report, which I fully endorse. While Murray had no branch closures in this round of cuts, we have suffered from a reduction in the mobile banking provision, particularly in Lossiemouth, which has lost one of the visits each week to allow the mobile bank to provide other areas that have lost their branches. So I noticed it was referenced at paragraph 75 of the report that the quality and availability of mobile banking is a concern. What more can we do to encourage RBS to improve the mobile banking, because they are currently letting people down in Lossiemouth and other areas of Murray?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his diligent account of his recollection of the report and in section 75, and he's absolutely right. And we did have an extended conversation with RBS during the report about the availability of the mobile branch bank system. And already what we're beginning to detect, probably in his constituency as in mine, are real issues as these mobile branches are expected to serve some of the closed impacted areas. And I think that where RBS were determined to try and assure us that effective and efficient timetables will be drawn up, the evidence thus far is that they've not been able to secure and produce this. And again, as part of our rolling brief and our ability to continue to monitor this, we'll keep a very clear eye on what's happening, because this is one of the real points of contact where customers can access banking services, and it's an important feature of part of the new delivery by services.
Jed Killen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for a very thorough account of what I think was an excellent report, save from the disappointing lack of any input from the UK Government. Does he agree with me that it's going to be very difficult for the reprieved branches to meet any meaningful increase in use, with restricted opening times, with a lack of a full range of services and with targets for customers to be moved online?
Yeah, I think the honourable gentleman is absolutely right, and I've noted the amount of questions that have been asked about the reprieve branches and the real interest in this as an example of what could be done. And I think that RBS actually owe it to this House to demonstrate that they're looking at this responsibly, that they're not just setting up these branches to fail. These are branches that should be given every opportunity to demonstrate their effectiveness and their ability to pick up footfall and customers. And I really hope that, like if RBS are listening to the statement, which I'm pretty sure they are, they will hear the real concerns from members right across this House about the 10 reprieve branches, and they will do everything possible to assist them to try and meet whatever criteria that are going to be set. But the important thing is they get an independent reviewer in place just now, and we're able to assess the criteria for keeping these branches open.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Look, one of the key findings of our committee's very good report, and one I think reflected in some of the comments by other honourable members today, was that RBS's impact assessments didn't provide sufficient information on individual branches, such as did customers have sufficiently reliable access to broadband, how practical it was for them to travel to the next branch, or what alternative services were available in their area. Would you agree with me there, therefore, that the Lending Standard Board's very limited interpretation of impact is woefully inadequate, allowing RBS to avoid its responsibilities to our communities, and that it's vital the Board now listens to the communities affected by bank closures and widens the criteria it uses?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, who again is a very diligent member of this Select Committee, and I thank her for her comments. And I think that what we did find, and we've said this in the report, is that we have to be very careful about the role of the Lending Standards Board when it comes to this. Is a self-regulatory body with a voluntary code of practice. And what we ask government to consider very carefully is, if this isn't working, which seems to be the case, because what we're having here is dissatisfied communities who feel that they've had no role in ensuring that their voice has been heard around a consultation about branch closures, maybe start to consider a statutory code of practice, and certainly allow the opportunity for consultation to be made prior to a branch closure, not post-branch closure, as is currently the case.
David Linden.
Deputy Speaker, can I commend my honourable friend from Perth and North Perthshire on an excellent report, and that of his committee as well. In my own constituency, Steps are due to lose their branch. My dealings with RBS so far would indicate that they probably know more about Steps the band than Steps the community. They have had absolutely no impact in terms of this campaign at all, which has been really disappointing. But will my honourable friend join me in calling upon the government to support the bill brought forward by my honourable friend from Ceredigion, the Access to Banks bill, which would in particular support rural branches and community hubs?
Yeah. Yes, I would. I've seen the honourable gentleman's bill, a very fine bill it is too, and I hope that the Minister does take cognizance of the very many fine recommendations which are included in all this. I think that what we're seeing here, and this is the last question I know that's been taken forward, is something needs to be done just about the consultation around these bank closures. That it's clearly that there are issues with the Lending Standards Board's role in all of this, and I think that what we really need to do as we go forward now is to, even in just a consultation type of exercise, it needs to be very closely looked at, and I look forward to our honourable friend's bill making steady progress through the House.
Thank you. We now come to the